Hey everyone, welcome back to Rhythm Railroad. This is part 4 of the Intermodal Yard project. I haven't done too much since the last video I put up, but uh, I did do a few modifications and some new things that, are slow going because of the way plaster works. I mentioned that on my last video. Letting things dry and redoing and letting things dry and repainting, all that stuff takes time. So anyways, here's where I'm at. I ran into a little bit of a problem with the main pad here because once I was done, you saw that everything was painted already and looking good. But when I rolled the cars into the section here, I noticed that there was a lot of binding and it was very bumpy and rough. And even though most of the time there's not going to be a locomotive that actually enters the pad, it's just going to be cars getting pushed back. I didn't want it to look so rough, especially when you're slow. When you're pushing the cars in slowly, they tend to, be very jerky because it's getting caught up on the plaster. So what I ended up realizing is that the gaps that I made originally weren't quite wide enough, so it was catching the inside of the flange on both sides of the wheel of the. So it was gripping. I also noticed that when I went to clean the track, some of the areas outside the track were a little too high, so it was making the cars kind of lift. So I went back and I started cleaning all that stuff up. I started getting the wider gaps, scraping some of that plaster out. I realized that because this is Coach 70 track, it's lower, so I had to really get the plaster out of the bottom of the pit because in some sections there was still a little plaster there, even though it looked like there was a gap and it was kicking the cars up. So I went ahead and cleaned that up nicely. But with that, when I did that, that introduced more problems, and that is that I started scraping some of the stuff that was too high off, which then exposed the plaster, which is white. So I had to go back again and repaint everything, which is fine. But at least now I can get access to the rails or the rail heads without necessarily affecting what's around it. So in other words, I could take something, some kind of cleaner and scrape and not hit the plaster around it. And that was my main goal, just to be able to, get the rail heads clean. So with that said, I repainted. I went, with the same process. I went with the darker Rust-Oleum color, which, by the way, somebody commented, I forget who did that, but they commented that the name of the Rust-Oleum paint might be on the bottom. Let's see. So I don't see it here. It's just kind of dates and times and I guess numbers, identification numbers. But it might be what he suggested. It might be a sand color, which is I really really like it. So I just don't see it anywhere. Maybe it's on the cap. But anyways, that's not important. What's important is that. Nope. Oops. What's important is that I had to repaint with that color once again, and then I hit it with the lighter gray on top. And this time I decided not to go as heavy as the first time because I did want more of the darker concrete, kind of like here and here, right, to come through. So it looks a little bit more realistic, a little bit more weathered. This is just two-toned right now, so I have to add a few more layers of other grays and things to make it look more realistic. But it's a good starting point for paint. And once I was done with that and I let it dry, well, actually, here's the thing. I did not let it dry before cleaning the railheads, which is something that I tried to do intentionally because when I let it dry and I went back with some kind of scraping, tool, that's when I was running into problems because if the slightest angle would dig into the plaster and it would create a hole and take the paint right off and all that stuff. So what I did instead is once I hit it with the second coat of paint, I let it dry for I'm talking like maybe a minute, and then I went back with a good pencil eraser and just kind of very carefully rubbed through just to get most of the paint on top of the rails off. And whatever little sections I missed, I could just, go back later and clean, which I did. But I was able to pretty much do it without wrecking the sides of the rail plaster. So once I got that fixed and I was comfortable with that, then what I went ahead and started doing is getting the other parts of the facility completed. While I was fixing this, I was actually filling in the back here because it was so detached. So I was able to get, 2 coats of plaster back there. If you recall, I only had like a strip of plaster here, and this was completely empty. So I was able to get that. I sanded it down. I hit it with the paint. The paint looks like a mess, but it's okay because it's going to be mostly covered with containers and trailers and things like that. But either way, I wanted that to look really banged up back there, like it's never maintained. And so what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to weather it further and add cracks and things like that. So it looks like different from this, but not terrible, not like a completely different shade, but just less maintained. And then, once I was done with that, then I was able to start on the main roads, which is this here and this here. This is like the entrance road, and this is the exit road. And I ran out of plaster anyway, and yesterday was 4th of July, so I wasn't able to get any, so that slowed me down even more. So this morning I went out and got a bucket of plaster, and was able to basically put this down. This is like literally, I just finished doing it. So what I did to make this work is that, first of all, I made a barrier like I spoke about on my last video. And I did it with the masonite board, just a long strip of masonite board. And the way I got the height is by putting another piece of masonite, this is equal to the rail height. So I put it up against, flat against the benchwork, and then it just, figured out what would be flush. And then once I got it, completely level, then I just tacked it in all the way through. Unfortunately, I didn't realize that the masonite board actually was cut a little lower here. So I'll do that later, but I got up to where it was still level, and then it just, worked with that. And so now I could take my blade. Well, before I did that, I added the tape, and I put it over the part that was done already so I wouldn't ruin that, and also so that I could easily, bring the knife through that section without having to worry so much about getting plaster on the other side. Obviously, I still had to be careful because it's not that much tape. So, I got close a few times. But, once I had the height, then I knew it was going to be level to this other pad. So I went through as best as I could. I never... Well, I shouldn't say I never, but lately I've been not worrying so much about getting it perfect on the first pass. I just try to get it as good as I can. But you can see there's still holes and bubbles and things like that. On the first pass, it's always rough. And it's, what happens is if you go back, it makes it worse because then it starts to lift the plaster. So I just did it as smooth as I could. And once it dries, it'll be easier to just go back and patch those low points. And then I did the same thing on the other side. I added the tape on either end, and I was able to get this other road figured out. So once this dries, I'm going to leave the tape down, but once this dries, I'm going to go over again, and even with the tape down, I'm going to paint it. This way everything is just done without, having to do the taping twice. I'm hoping that this tape that I used is not going to rip the paint off the plaster, which has happened before, but I feel like the blue tape, like the typical blue masking tape, is a lot more aggressive when you stick it to anything. And so when I used that tape, it was ripping up the paint. But this stuff, I got this a long time ago, but I didn't realize that it was less aggressive. This is called frog tape. And I don't know, this particular one doesn't have as much glue on it, or it's not as sticky as the blue stuff. So I'm hoping that will give me the coverage, but still not rip up the paint. once I finally take it off. And if it does, I'm going to have to go back and touch things up. But, we'll deal with that when that comes. So yeah, that's where I'm at right now. I'm going to obviously, this is going to take a little while for it to dry, and I'm going to have to go back and redo things and touch things up. But once I do that, I will make these roads. I'm probably going to make them like an asphalt color, like a more like black grayish kind of color. And so it'll give a sense of separation, or the way things are in the real world, where like the roads are a different shade than the platforms. I've seen I've been using a lot of prototypical pictures to kind of give me a heads up on how things are. But if you take a look here, something like that versus that, or here, there's a lot of different ways of doing it. But I kind of like the different shade that I showed you here, this photo here. I kind of like the way that looks, so I might go with that. But I've seen all kinds of combinations, even some with where the ballast is still in between the pads, like this, right? So I decided to go against it just because I think it's going to be 10 times more work to get that figured out. It's just, that's a lot. That's a lot to do. So we're going to leave it there for now. And hopefully when I see you on part 5, this will be at least fully covered. And then, I do have to continue the pavement here. And also I got to figure out what to do here. Whether I'm going to make it just a road that goes that way, or where I'm going to cover all this. I'll probably end up covering most of it, because I want to have the ability to get off the road. And, if a vehicle needs to go through here for whatever reason, there has to be pavement there. And then I think I am definitely going to do the overpass here with the bridge that goes over the tracks. But I have to build up all the bench work and the whatever retaining walls need to be done. The last thing I did before the end of the day yesterday is that I glued this track down. These two tracks were not glued down yet, so I glued them down. And since this is code 83 and this is code 70, I had to solder the code 70 on top of the railers, on the rail joiners, to make sure that this is not uneven. So I got that pretty close. I might have to file it down a tiny bit just to get it. There's a little lip on this one only. These 3 are fine. And then I also soldered a wire to the frog. I put a frog juicer down there under the benchwork, and all I got to do now is cut the gaps, so that there are feeders hooked up to these tracks somewhere in the middle here. So obviously you need some kind of, these are live frogs, so I need some kind of reverser, which is the frog juicer, so it doesn't short. But I was waiting for the glue. I made the glue a little heavier where I'm going to cut those gaps, so that it creates some kind of like stronghold. And I do that with everywhere I make a gap, so that when I cut it, the rails don't shift. And it's worked out nicely throughout the last few sections that I cut like that. So that's where I'm at. All right, so I will see you guys in part 5. Thanks.